Welcome to Stuff You Missed in History Class, a production of iHeartRadio.
Hello and happy Friday. I'm Tracy V. Wilson.
And I'm Holly Fry.
We talked about United States versus Wong Kim arc this week.
Yeah.
We stressed that we could not keep up with everything about it as I was researching it.
Yeah, in terms of the current events related to this.
Yeah. It really felt like every single day there was new commentary, new arguments and new counter arguments, new everything. But then in addition to that, just a continual fire hose of stuff also happening. And I think anytime there has been an episode like this one, where there has been a specific reason that something felt urgent, it has also felt like there have been 50 other equally urgent things happening simultaneously.
Mm-hmm.
There is no way to do all 50 things. And then additionally, in the 2 weeks that pass-ish, 2 weeks approximately that pass between researching and writing the episode and the episode actually coming out, 50 more things are going to happen. And then like exponential escalation of things involving what we were actually talking about.
Yeah.
And it's one of the reasons why it is not that often that I decide to do an episode that's directly related to something that's happening in the news right now.
Yeah, it's building a house on shifting sand. Like there's always going to be some key element that emerges that we didn't include because you can't.
Yeah. While I do not necessarily like the content of old Supreme Court decisions, sometimes I do like reading the old Supreme Court decisions. Sometimes they just include interesting things about, the mindset of the time and the justices that were writing it. This particular one, though, the majority opinions synopsis of what was happening previously, it goes on for so long.
Yeah.
So long. And each case that it's talking about previously is maybe only a paragraph long, but I really struggled with it. It felt like it was going on forever. And I was like, I want to get to the part where you're telling me about this case specifically. I understand what you're doing by building up the immense precedent that we are already talking about. But like, can we fast forward a little bit?
I imagine probably, right. It's exactly that. They know that this is something that not everybody sides with, and they want to be able to protect people with just a mass of paperwork and precedent examples.
Yeah.
But it does sometimes make it difficult to actually get through the content of the decision.
Yeah. This was also not a court that was racially progressive in any way.
Right.
And it had other decisions that were really the opposite of this one in terms of talking about the ideas of things like equality. And one of the things that we've talked about before is John Marshall Harland, who became known as the Great Dissenter, writing dissenting opinions for some of these previous cases where the court had taken a stance that was, just broadly speaking, not in favor of equality. And he had written just a scathing dissent of that picked apart all of it. And then in this case, he also dissented, but this dissent was the dissent of, no, this should not be citizens for Chinese people. Obviously not. So anyway, I find that interesting about him. I also had a little bit more in this episode originally about Justice Stephen J. Field. A couple of sources that I read framed him as being the only justice that had really expressed any kind of support for the idea of birthright citizenship. I don't actually know how accurate that is. it was not a situation where I could go and look up the entire scope of his previous
Right.
career as a Supreme Court justice. But he was also a justice during some of the other cases that we talked about that did not seem, I was like, it does not seem like there were things that made it read almost like, yeah, he was the one person who was in charge, who was like in favor of birthright citizenship, but he had other cases that he had
That
been
were not
part
that
of.
way.
Yeah, they were definitely not that way. Like he was part of the majority in Plessy versus Ferguson, which upheld racial segregation. He was part of the majority in Chai Chong-ping versus the United States. We have episodes about both of those. And, that Plessy versus Ferguson establishing that segregation was constitutional. Like that was also part of, I think, the same court. Melville Fuller was definitely still the justice. So anyway, that's been one of the things that people have pointed out with this executive order was that like this case came before a court that had made a lot of pretty specifically racist interpretations of the Constitution. And even within that context was like, no, this is saying everyone is a citizen if they're born here.
Right.
Including Chinese people.
Even the people who probably didn't want to say that had to acknowledge it.
They had to do it. Yeah.
Not that it would ever be a thing I could do, but every time we talk about the Supreme Court and a decision and dissenters, I just know I could never be a judge on the Supreme Court because I couldn't like go to work with those people the next day and be cool. I just couldn't. I know who I am, and it's not that.
Yep.
I pretend that people that irritate me or make me angry at work don't exist anymore. It's not a good habit, but it's something that I just involuntarily do, so that wouldn't work.
Yeah. I think I have I might have told this story on the podcast before. A friend of mine is a lawyer, and we have been friends starting from before he decided to change careers and go to law school. And while he was in law school, there was a case that was happening in the news in which a person's behavior had been odious and awful. And that person is still entitled to competent legal representation. That's sort of how that idea works. Everyone is entitled to competent legal representation no matter what they have done. My friend's spouse, who I'm also friends with, I love them both dearly. They came into the room continuing a conversation on this subject that had started in the car. And it was clear that she was furious. And he was like, this is just how it has to work. And then said that like one of the things they learn in law school is that if you try to talk about some of this with people who aren't lawyers, it's violently upsetting.
Yeah.
Because you have to train your brain to work in this way that's about what the law says and what the Constitution says and not necessarily like what seems right to you.
Which is part of where I get hung up. I'm like, but that's messed up.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyway.
I do not have enough grace in my heart for such things, it turns out.
I get it.
Fine. Yeah. Yeah. This is why I'm spending a lot of time looking at plants for my mental health right now. Like, look at my garden. Plants.
I understand this. I like to take lots of walks.
Yeah, you do an out in nature thing. I do a bring nature inside thing.
Yeah. Well, the reason we haven't done the bring nature inside thing at our house is when we have tried to have plants, the cats have not used them as litter boxes, but they have liked to just pull things out of pots.
Yeah.
And our house is just not set up in a way that there's like places that plants can go that cats can't access.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah. Anyway.
Plants, which are going to inform future episodes, just FYI.
I'm not sure what my next episode is. Of course, there are a million things that feel like are urgent to talk about on the show, but I do not have the fortitude to do urgent things all the time in a climate of a fire hose of horribleness, which is what is going on right now. So. One of our episodes this week was on Daniel Hale Williams. Technically, Daniel Hale Williams the third, but I think we only said the third part one time. There are several books about him that are children's books. A couple of them have the name Dr. Dan in the title. I only know of one full-length biography for adults of him. And that was published by a white woman named Helen Buckler in 1954 using research that had started in the late 1940s. So when Buckler was researching this book, there were people still living who had personally known him. The foreword of this book is really interesting because it talks about her own experiences of basically crossing a color barrier to learn about him and becoming more aware of her own privilege and her own ignorance while doing all of that. Apparently, there were people so surprised that she was doing this research on a Black surgeon that they assumed that she was a Black person with very fair skin.
Oh, how fascinating.
Yeah. So like really interesting to me, that part of it. So of course, if you go and you read this book, parts of it are going to seem dated, by today's standards and the language and how it talks about things. But like to me, the fact that she was at a time of intense racial segregation and also backlash to the civil rights movement that she was doing this work. Montague Cobb, William Montague Cobb, who we've also talked about on the show, wrote a couple of different profiles of Daniel Hale Williams. That's one of the things that Cobb did, was write profiles of figures from Black history. And in one of these, he says that Buckler had started researching this biography because she was so fascinated with the idea that the first surgeon to do an open heart surgery was Black. And then her own research revealed that there were earlier surgeries, that he wasn't actually the first one, and that when that happened, her publisher lost interest in it. If that's accurate, she did find another publisher fairly quickly after that, because the book came out originally in 1954. And then all of that led me to say we should do a Saturday classic of William Montague Cobb, because it's been 4 entire years since that episode came out. And I would have said it was last year.
I would have said it was last month. I mean,
yeah. All the time since 2020 has really, really blurred together. So anyway, that'll be coming up as a Saturday classic. I also found Daniel Hale Williams to be kind of an interesting comparison to Vivian Thomas, who we have talked about on the show before.
Yeah.
Vivian Thomas came along decades later and is kind of an example of how like shifts in the world and segregation specifically, because Daniel Hale Williams was born before the Civil War, grew up during the Civil War. I have no idea what his experiences of the Civil War years were like. Lived through Reconstruction. When he went to medical school, it was at a time of escalating racial segregation and escalating violence against Black people and Black communities in response to basically the Reconstruction's progress. But I think this is what enabled him to go to medical school and start practicing surgery when he did. I didn't really find detail about whether, like, how many other Black students there might have been at the school at the same time, what the process was like for him, whether the admissions people were aware of his race or anything like that.
Right.
But it was like he went to school and started working at an era when there was somewhat more integration in Chicago. And then Chicago became increasingly more segregated in the face of like the Great Migration of Black families out of the South. And then Vivian Thomas, much later, segregation a lot more entrenched, a lot more explicitly spelled out in terms of laws and things. Vivian Thomas also broke a lot of ground with surgery, but not as a surgeon, as a surgical technician. So I found those as two interesting things or an interesting comparison to think about with the two of them.
Yeah, it is kind of fascinating that we go forward in time, but backwards in terms of
Yeah.
ways to make things happen. I don't even
Yeah.
want to say opportunity because it's not so much that as him making a path.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Um, so much progress happened during Reconstruction that was then explicitly dismantled.
Mhm.
So yeah. I also originally had this in the actual body of the episode, but it just felt like it was a weird aside anywhere in the flow of the narrative that I tried to put it. And that's about Emma Reynolds, who, had
Yeah.
wanted to be a nurse. She'd wanted to be a nurse. Her brother went to Williams about her not being able to train to be a nurse. I think her brother's original thought might have been that Williams might just pull some strings for her. I don't know if he really went into it thinking we're going to start an entire hospital.
I'm going to make work for myself.
But Emma Reynolds was accepted into that first class of nursing students. She graduated from the nursing program at Providence Hospital in 1893. From there, she went on to Medical College of Chicago, and she earned a medical degree there in 1895. So she became the first Black woman to graduate from the Medical College of Chicago.
That's so cool.
Which I found also, of course, very interesting.
Yes.
I wish I had had more like first person accounts of what Daniel Hale Williams' life was like, what his relationship with his mother was like. It really felt like a lot of people were very critical of his mother, but I also felt like I was reading people's judgments and like not reading the facts of what happened, if that makes sense.
Yes, and that's actually one of the things in his story that jumps out to me because this is a thing have learned late in life. I don't want to blow anybody's mind, but parents are humans.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
It becomes so easy, I think, too, because we kind of set up this like very specific caricature of what it is to be a parent and specifically a mother. And if people don't like fit into what that is for whatever reason,
Yeah.
even if it's completely reasonable and understandable, people get real weird about it and real judgy in a minute.
Yeah.
And I'm like, this is a Black woman at a time when things are starting to go in a really yucky direction, in addition to dealing with the loss of her spouse and trying to figure out how to manage her own life and the lives of her kids. Was she a great mom? I don't know, but like I don't feel like I'm in any position to put any judgment on that situation because it's a lot.
Well, and I also think of like the decision that she and her two oldest daughters were going to go to Illinois and they were going to learn to, as I understand it, become hairdressers.
Right.
Which was like one of the things that Black women could do to support themselves and their families and could do really well at. And so like just the fact of that, of like, okay, I and the two older girls who are old enough to, start working, we're going to learn hair stuff. I'm like, yeah, that seems like a reasonable plan to me.
Yeah, same.
It also seems not possible to do that if you also have 4 other children to care for.
Right.
So like the fact of having to split up the children does sound horrifying, but also like what other option might there have been?
Right. I think too the judgments of it to me, and I didn't do the research, so you may have insight that shifts this. It seems to decontextualize the fact that that was not all that uncommon a practice in a situation like that where some catastrophic thing had happened to a family and often the loss of the primary breadwinner was like, okay, who in the family can help? Where can we put these kids? Often it meant splitting them up among relatives' houses.
Yep.
That wasn't an unusual path.
Yep.
So for her to have that level of scrutiny and kind of be characterized as though she abandoned her kids is unsettling and obviously rooted in the bias of racism, I'm sure. Yeah.
Yeah, that happened in my grandmother's family.
Yeah, not
and-
uncommon at all.
Yeah. So, yeah, I wish I had like more specific detail, because what I read really felt like people had a lot of judgment of her, and I could not figure out whether those judgments were really justified or not. I also went down a rabbit hole while researching this episode of whether a surgery on the pericardium is an open heart surgery, since the heart muscle and the pericardium are two different things, but the pericardium is part of the way the heart functions. And generally the answer seemed to be yes. Like that surgically the heart and the pericardium are one organ.
They are two parts of the greater whole. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, I guess if you're gonna actually something, the more of the actually is that there had been other surgeries on the pericardium before this that he just did not know had happened when he did them.
Right.
Or when he did the one that he wrote the paper about. There were, I think, at least 2 other surgeries to repair someone's pericardium that he did after that. The one that he became most known for, that person lived another something like 38 years. And one of his other patients reportedly lived another 50 years. The fact that we didn't have antibiotics at that point, also pretty incredible, even with all of the steps that he was taking for hygiene and antiseptic procedures during the surgery itself.
That's also where it starts to be a little infuriating to see the way that politics led to this person who was incredibly bold as a practicer of medicine, medical practitioner, in ways that was saving people, having him like literally nickeled and dimed in terms of like, I don't know, there was a box of envelopes that went missing while you were here. Like, it just seems so petty and stupid and gross at that point.
It also seemed like there was petty infighting at every single medical facility that was part of this. And it just kind of made me think this explains why there's so many doctor shows full of interpersonal dynamics. I know that it's not really realistic what happens on the doctor shows, but it seemed like every single one of them, if it was a facility of any size at all, there were people who hated each other and were trying to undermine each other at all of them, regardless of the prominence of the hospital or who worked there.
In my naivete, I'm like, shouldn't you be about the greater mission of caring for people's health instead of trying to be the most one or whatever it is you're after?
Right.
But again, that's a very naive way to look at it.
Yeah. Anyway, hey, whatever's happening on your weekend, I hope it is absolutely as good as possible. We are recording all these at least 2 weeks ahead of when the weekend is coming. So I have no idea what's happening in the world on this Friday of our Friday behind the scenes. But we will be back with a Saturday Classic tomorrow. I think the Saturday Classic tomorrow is going to be about William Montague Cobb. And then we'll have something brand new on Monday. Stuff You Missed in History Class is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.